Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much to SANS for inviting me here today. I'm just waiting for my slides to pop up. Oh, they're here. Almost. Okay, great. So today I'm going to talk about a data-driven approach that we've developed in Glasgow and that we're using to expand knowledge of facial communication beyond its traditional boundaries and towards a deeper and more diverse understanding. So as we know, the human face is an incredibly powerful social stimulus that can generate a very high number of complex dynamic patterns, which we call facial expressions. And since Darwin's seminal theory of the biological origins of facial expressions, a long-standing goal has been to identify amongst all of these complex variations of face movements which of those are culturally common and which are culture-specific. And this particularly challenging goal, I think, is summed up very nicely by Labar, who said that in the language of gesture all over the world, there are varying mixtures of the physiologically conditioned response and the purely cultural one, and it is frequently difficult to analyze out and segregate the two. Now, to address this question, pioneering research by Darwin, Ekman, and others used an approach where they selected photographs of facial expressions that they thought represented basic emotions such as happy, surprise, fear, disgust, anger, and sad, such as these ones, and then showed them to people in different cultures to see if they recognized these facial expressions as these particular emotions. And from these really early judgment studies, and many of the studies that followed using a similar approach, it was reported that these 6 specific facial expression patterns are recognized across all cultures. And these facial expressions soon became the gold standard in research. So many people would tell me that you couldn't get published unless you used these stimuli. So these are the facial expressions. They're universal, and that's just the job done, right? Everyone can go home now, nothing more to see here. So, however, a closer inspection of these data, which I did during my PhD, actually suggests that our knowledge of facial expression communications in humans is rather limited. So, for example, and first of all, extensive cross-cultural recognition studies, including Ekman's, have consistently shown that these particular facial expressions are not recognized well across cultures. And in fact, they elicit considerable variance in recognition accuracy and actually are more likely to represent Western facial expressions because they're recognized very well in Western cultures, but less so in other cultures. So this then raises the question of which facial expressions convey these particular emotions in other cultures. We don't have a good representation of these currently with the standardized facial expressions. The second is that this approach introduced a compound sampling bias. So if you imagine this circle is all of the facial expressions the human face can make, this is obviously for illustrative purposes. So firstly, the vast majority of research on facial expressions have focused on emotions only. And also within that, only a small subset of 6 emotions have been tested, which of course is a very narrow range given the wide range of nuanced emotions that can exist. Then within that, there's only a small set of facial expressions that have been tested. So usually the 6 specific facial expressions that I showed you earlier, which of course represents a very small proportion of the facial expressions the human face can make. These facial expressions were also selected, of course, in a top-down manner by the experimenters based on their intuitions and hypotheses. Finally, the facial expressions used are static. And so they remove any potentially important dynamic information such as the temporal order of the face movements or their intensity. So together these 4 components create a compound sampling bias that has restricted knowledge of facial expressions to this little circle here. Now, given the real complexity of understanding facial expressions as illustrated earlier, these limitations are, of course, understandable, right? But now we're at this really, really exciting juncture where we can use new methodological developments to expand knowledge beyond these traditional boundaries and understand facial expressions in all their complexity, including what is cross-cultural and what is culture-specific. And one approach that we've developed in Glasgow uses very much the same perception-based approach that's been used in traditional research, that is showing faces to people and asking them to rate them or categorize them, but has a psychophysical twist. So let me show you how that works. So imagine that you see this person. The person might look to probably most of you like they're maybe angry or disgusted. Hands up if you think they look angry or disgusted. Oh, quite a lot of people, right. Okay, most people say, yeah, that looks like anger or disgust, they're pretty confident. Now, what about the next person? So oftentimes when we show this facial expression to people, they're like, well, I'm not really sure. Maybe they have gas, I don't know. Who knows? So this facial expression doesn't seem to be very familiar to most of the people that I show this to. So, these facial expressions, whoops. So I'll just keep talking while they sort this out. Oh, no, it's still here. Okay, so here they both are. Okay, so the psychophysical twist here is that these facial expressions have been randomly generated. We haven't hand-selected the action units or the face movements that go into these stimuli. And what we do is we show these random facial expressions to people and then use the perception of the individual to identify which facial expressions are socially meaningful and which ones are not. So I'll show you now how we generate these facial expressions. Okay, so to generate these facial expressions, we use a dynamic facial expression generator that was built by you and colleagues in Glasgow, and they recruited a group of fax coders. I'm assuming everybody knows what fax is, right? So these people that are specially trained to make individual face movements on their face, like nose wrinkler, eyebrow raiser, etc. And we recorded each of these face movements, each of these action units using a stereoptic system. Each action unit can then be parametrically activated using a number of temporal parameters such as acceleration, sustainment, and so on to control their movement. So then by activating and combining different action units together, we can create almost any facial behavior. So to generate these facial expressions in the experiment, we can randomly sample a subset of individual face movements, such as these from this large library, and assign a random movement to each face movement, which we then combine to create a random facial expression stimulus. The observer then categorizes the stimulus according to, for example, the 6 classic emotions, if and only if this facial expression corresponds with their prior knowledge. So if they think it's sad, they choose sad. If they think it kind of looks like sad, they choose other or don't know. So this means that on each trial, we can capture the specific dynamic action unit patterns that convey these particular emotion messages to individuals in a given culture. So it's an agnostic sampling, and we're really using the perception of an individual in a given culture to tell us which face movements represent different social messages such as emotions. So after many such trials, we can then build a statistical relationship between these dynamic action unit patterns presented on each trial and the observer's responses to produce a mathematical model of each facial expression. And that means that we have a precise quantitative representation of each facial expression that we can formally analyze and compare across cultures. It's important also to note that we also compute a model for each individual observer in the experiment so that we can understand population variance, or we can estimate population variance, and to be able to demonstrate the replication of results across n participants. So we've been using this approach of agnostically sampling face movements and using cultural perception to model dynamic facial expressions across cultures with the goal of expanding knowledge. So I'm just going to show you a summary of the results. I'm just looking at the time. There's going to be a whistle-stop tour through some of the main results. I'll be around later if people have questions about these. So first of all, we use this technique to look at cultural variance and commonalities. I want to really highlight that we're looking at both. I'm really not on one side of the fence or other. People ask me this all the time, and I really want to know everything, not just one part of it. So looking at cultural variants and commonalities, we have modelled, for example, the 6 basic facial expressions of emotion in 2 cultures to identify variants in some of these face movements and commonalities. Some of the variants actually represent or reflect Western and East Asian emoticons. So Western emoticons often show variants in the mouth region, whereas East Asian emoticons tend to show variants in the eye region. Following this, we increased the number of emotions tenfold, from 6 to 60 different emotions. We modelled facial expressions across 2 cultures, and we wanted to look at the underlying, the latent expressive patterns across this wider variance of facial expressions. And what we found are that there were 4, not 6, culturally common expressive patterns. Because we also model dynamic facial expressions, we can also understand or can examine the specific temporal order of action units. And what we found is that there's a specific temporal structure that face movements follow, following this sort of hierarchical, basic to more complex face signaling. With this technique, we can also model facial expressions of very, very specific different types of emotions or different social messages as well. So in principle, we can really use any label in the experiment. I showed you 6 basic emotions earlier, but we've really used a wide range of different emotions and other social messages. I should also point out that all of the models that we derive and then take forward for further analysis are validated within a culture as well, within their culture. We've also looked at going beyond emotions. We've also looked at conversational facial expressions, looking again at cultural similarities and differences. We also have looked more at very specific types of smiles, for example, so looking at very specific types of emotions. Also at pain and pleasure, and also at personality traits. A lot of the work in the personality traits has really looked at face morphology and complexion and so on, but we modelled facial expressions of different personality traits. So this person here is rated as very untrustworthy. Their morphology is rated as very untrustworthy. But when we add a trustworthy dynamic facial expression, the person is then rated as trustworthy as the most trustworthy face morphology. So we show that facial expressions really contribute to that, those social judgments. And in more recent work, we've also looked at very fundamental signals of social communication, such as valence and arousal. This is upcoming work. So now, here we go. So by exploring then this really broad range of facial expressions, so broader emotions and beyond emotions as well, and across different cultures, we can then identify the latent expressive structures of social face signaling that can inform psychological theories of human communication. For example, some of our data suggests that social face signaling follows a specific temporal structure where early face movements convey broad dimensional information that could be culturally common, with later accents refining the social message for more culture-specific communication, and that could cause cultural confusions later in the signaling dynamics. So a further application then of deriving a formal generative model of social face signaling is that we can equip artificial agents with them so that they can generate face signals to engage their human users in different social and cultural contexts. And by doing so, we have shown that this significantly improves their performance for recognizability of the facial expressions, particularly across cultures, because a lot of social robots are equipped with the standardized facial expressions that are not recognized by in East Asian cultures, and also for judgments of human likeness. Now, the face isn't just all about facial expressions, of course. It also comes in a variety of shapes and colors, which can also influence our social judgments. So having refined this approach that I've presented today with face movements, we're also now applying it to 3D face morphology and complexion to derive a new synergistic account of social face perception. So a face algebra, if you like. So before I finish, I just want to show you some developments that we've made to this particular platform. So the first thing is that we've improved some of the shading, the dynamic shading, and the mouth. We've also added eye movements. We also have blushing, so we have like action units that basically blush effectively. This will just increase a parametric space, which is a bit of a nightmare, but you know. These ones just show actually sweating and shading, but I'm just going to quickly skip them. And we also have head movements, nodding, and we've modeled nodding and things like that. We can also, everyone loves that one. We can also create super stimuli as well, which of course is quite relevant for the design of social robotics. We can do this with face movements, shape, complexion, etc. We can also generate an infinite number of face identities. The university always wants me to have like consent from these people to show them publicly, and I keep reminding them that they're not real people. So we passed the Turing test, which is great. I love it. So I realize I'm out of time, so thank you very much to all of my collaborators. I've been really lucky to have fantastic collaborators, lots of funding. Thank you to SANS, excuse me. I want to also say that I've got a PhD studentship, and we also have an additional 50 PhD studentships, so if you've got good people, send them my way. Great, thank you very much.